Professor Andy Miah or Andy Miah?
It's Miah.
Miah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I thought because you're from the UK, you have to Miah.
Well, the name's actually from Bangladesh. My father was from Bangladesh.
Oh, really?
So it's, far from the UK.
Far from the UK. I want to talk with you about human augmentation, human enhancement, because the last Gartner report, you know Gartner with the hype cycle, they mentioned human augmentation as one of the key trends for the upcoming years. How did you become interested in the topic of improving humans or humanity?
Well, it was really when I was starting a PhD. And at the time, this was when the Human Genome Project was beginning to reach completion. And I remember reading an article in New Scientist magazine that was all about performance genes. The idea being that you could identify and perhaps even select or modify genes that could optimize our capacity to be a better athlete. And this got me thinking about, well, could we imagine a future where the Genome Project delivered designer people that would be far more capable than us at running, jumping, throwing, whatever? And how would that change society? So it was really that Human Genome Project and the discussion about designer people that really piqued my interest. And it seemed to be at a time when it was becoming a reality. And certainly for the world of sport, which has for many years had anxieties about performance enhancement, it was at the time and still seemed to be the biggest topic facing the future of sports.
Yeah, because you're also a specialist on the domain of eSports. Yeah. But do you also think that for the upcoming Olympics there will be genetically enhanced athletes? Or?
That's a good question, because I've been asked that question for the last 8 Olympic Games.
Really?
In fact, I did a television interview in 2004 about this topic.
Yeah.
And then in 2012, I went on the same program and asked the same question. Are they here yet? And the reality is nobody really knows, because we don't have tests that could actually tell us. The scientific knowledge tells us that if people are genetically doping, then they probably are putting themselves at risk rather than enhancing their performance. But there is a lack of knowledge about what athletes are doing, and there always has been. One of the big challenges of anti-doping authorities is knowing what athletes are doing. They're always ahead of the testers. So I think I've always said it's reasonable to assume that genetic enhancement is happening in sports, and the world of sport should proceed on that basis. So even if we don't have evidence of people doing things, we need to think about approaches to dealing with that situation. But always, for me, the issue hasn't been about the athlete that may genetically modify themselves. The more interesting discussion is about the next generation of people that have been genetically modified and are more capable as a result of that. It's not the athlete that's doping, it's the next generation of people who were born already genetically enhanced. And what do we do about those?
Yeah, and with sports it's also interesting, because I read about, I think, a Finnish cross-country skier who had amazing sort of physical capabilities based on his gene. He was not genetically enhanced, but he just got lucky. And of course, you can have the same discussion about the female runner who is now, because of too high of level of testosterone, is excluded from her competition. It's a gray area sometimes. Where do you cut the line between and what is nature and what is not? What is enhancement?
It is a grey line, and it has always been difficult to say what is fair or what's acceptable. And for me, sport has always been a technological process. So the moment the foot hits the running track, there's a technological interaction taking place. Even the decisions about the sort of shape and size of sports playing fields, the size of balls, the size of rackets, all these things are technological configurations, and they are part of what makes sport possible. We are anxious particularly about doping technologies because they disrupt some sense of the natural human. But that idea for me is already really sort of vacuous. It doesn't make sense to talk about ourselves as simply natural. We're always a product of our interactions with the environment, which is technology, and it's also nature.
Yeah. Before I forget all the time, I want to do an introduction. Professor Andy Miah? Yeah, I got it right this time. You're a professor at the University of Salford, which is in Manchester,
That's right,
in the UK. And I saw you deliver a keynote presentation here at the Synergy SSH in Hilversum. And how can I summarize you? Because you're in media studies and in human enhancement and in social media and the academics, the role of the academics. Are you a jack of all trades, master of none?
Well, everything I do looks at how emerging technologies are changing humanity. And so that's the single thread through genetics, through AI, through digital, through life extension. And it's really about that moment when a technology or the possibility of a technology creates a moral problem for us that always fascinates me. I remember maybe 20 years ago now walking into a bookstore, and on the magazine rack was a magazine that was about pregnancy and birth. And on the front page, it said, "Have you saved your baby's stem cells?" This was at a time when the possibility of harvesting blood from the umbilical cord was now affordable and possible. And the implication is that parents should do this in order to protect their children against blood-related disorders. And there we have a moral dilemma for somebody. Do they spend the 2,000 euros on harvesting the blood, or do they actually leave that to chance? And it's that problem arising from choice that technology often confronts us with that is really at the heart of everything. There's a wonderful book from 1995 written by some bioethicists titled From Chance to Choice. And it is that burden of choice that technology presents us with. It's something that we have to do something about, because even leaving it to chance is already a choice.
Yeah. And you discussed like the next level of fertility, etc. And we talked about sports, but another domain in which I'm really fascinated with concerning the use of technology to upgrade human capabilities is the army. Do you sometimes get asked by the UK army to talk about the super soldiers, etc.?
I have been asked by forces
classified.
Not really classified, but I have had conversations with people working in the military about these possibilities. And I think what's interesting about the military context is actually that there has been for many years, perhaps always, experimentation with technologies to reinforce the personnel, to make them stronger, more capable of surviving within extreme environments. That's where the link between sports and the military is often very close. In fact, many athletes, certainly historically, but still recently, have been in the military. They have this capacity to perform at extreme levels that you get from military training. I think what's really extraordinary now at the moment is the way in which the military is going down the direction of autonomous weapons. So I have a new book coming out on drone technology. One chapter deals with the possibility of drone-based warfare, and where that leads humanity is profound. Profound because, of course, one of the singularly most important acts people can undertake is the destruction of other people. And when those individuals are removed from the conflict field, it changes the nature of that interaction completely. And there's lots of really interesting research that talks about the detrimental impact of leaving conflict to autonomous weapons, because, of course, you can divorce your own sense of moral culpability from that act. If the machine takes the decision, which is what increasingly the military want to do, then who is responsible? How is responsibility upheld? But also, what is the process to actually take the decision to ensure that some kind of humanity remains present within that interaction? And the military has always been this amazing context. Not necessarily a positive one, because it often involves dealing with people whose capacity to consent is compromised by virtue of them being within a hierarchical militaristic system. So it's very difficult to say you're not going to take this substance that will ensure you don't need to go to the toilet for 3 days whilst you carry out a mission, because that's what your generals are telling you have to do. So a bit like sport, there is a almost kind of compromised autonomy or a negotiated autonomy that is in operation, which is very different from how we think about ourselves in everyday life, where you can broadly consent to most of the things that you do. If you're in a reasonably free country, you can do that. Whereas in sports, in military, often that quite purist notion of autonomy is often undermined, I think.
Yeah. But do we also have the chance that maybe in our lifetime or future generations that employers ask of their employees to maybe not some. I'll give you an example. There are factory workers working with exoskeletons, for example, which is, I think, you can debate if it's a augmentation or enhancement. But for example, when you are a surgeon and in 50 years, when you have brain chips, so you're more precise, etc. Do you think these kinds of human enhancements technologies will also come into the workforce, into the workplace, and really into human bodies?
I think many of those examples are already here. And you don't hear about it as a sort of formal part of your training. You don't become a surgeon and part of your kind of conventional formal training is to use beta blockers or some sort of pharmaceutical substances that help you be more steady as you are performing surgery. Yeah. But you hear of stories of people that are using such substances where they're using some kind of cognitive enhancement or physical enhancement to ensure they can perform more effectively. I remember actually, I was in a meeting where the International Olympic Committee president was talking about these issues. And you have to remember that the previous Olympic Committee president was also a surgeon. And he used the...
Thomas Bach?
No, it was... oh my gosh, I've completely forgot his name now. The previous president who actually said that these are legitimate in a surgical situation because we want surgeons to be as capable as possible. Yeah. His name was Jacques Rogge.
Oh, yeah.
And if you are a patient and you could, but this is the problem. If you're a patient and you want your surgeon to be as good as possible, and you could know with some certainty that if they use a beta blocker, they will be a better surgeon at that point, then it's rational to want your surgeon to use that. Now, the problem arises, however, that surgeon may in fact suffer from health-related conditions later on in his or her life as a result of using those substances. And they may not wish to do that, quite reasonably. But the problem is, what can we ask of people to do in the service of the task that they're performing for other people, and in the process compromise some aspect of their health? This is something that we're very uncomfortable with. As things stand, we don't ask people to do that unless you are soldiers.
Yeah. That's interesting because I also there was an institution in the Netherlands who did a survey on Dutch citizens, how they look at enhancement technologies, and there was also a clear distinction between the opinion of the respondents, like for example, a brain chip for soldiers, that's not okay because they can kill people, but a brain chip for a surgeon, so he or she can improve the work, it's okay. So it's also how we look at these kinds of enhancements depends on the purpose of the...
It does, but even in that example, you have a statement about a purpose that may be interpreted very differently. The reason why the soldier takes the pill or uses whatever it is to enhance themselves is not to increase their chances of being a good killer, not in succeeding in killing, but it's in succeeding in not being killed.
Yeah.
It's essentially a competitive situation. It's either kill or be killed. And I think that's where, and I'm not saying this is a good thing, but it's justified on the basis of increasing the chances of survival. If you look at a lot of military documentation and strategy, the core aspiration is not simply to win a war, but to minimize the loss to personnel, both in terms of lives lost, but also damage to people's lives. So one of the key obligations is, if you are leading an army into battle, is to employ the most effective technologies that will keep your personnel safe. But of course, for as long as your personnel are safe, it also means you're not losing the war. So it's that's where drones is interesting, because if you can imagine, having the best drones in a military conflict is probably a good way to secure your victory. The problem arises when everyone has the same capable drones that are creating essentially a stalemate. And it's the typical sort of Star Wars image of drones battling across the skies. It's just a constant, endless war of fire going from one place to the other, and nothing changes. So the consequence is significant, because ultimately, by removing the human that can suffer from the field of conflict, you just simply are replacing them with more and more robots and machines, and there's no resolution to the war. In many respects, I think the prospect of drone warfare gets us closer to the realization that war is ridiculous as a means of resolving conflict. So in that respect, I think it's probably a good thing. The problem is it'll take us a long time to get to that realization.
Yeah, it also makes me think of, I just read the book Ender's Game.
Oh yeah, it's a great book.
So maybe that's another component that you even are aware of, that you're strategizing a war.
Well, I mean, and actually we're already very close to that. So already many military strategies use gaming as a platform for recruitment and for skill development. The US Army even has its own computer game, which it uses with new recruits. 2015 or 16, I think it was, the Russian military created a tank whereby the interface was based on a PlayStation.
Oh.
And so we're actually seeing already the utilization of gamification of many activities as a platform towards recruitment for military personnel. And it makes sense really to me, because ultimately the most optimal interface works across all contexts, whether it is playing a computer game or operating a tank. And let's not forget, many games involve operating a tank. So these are, I think Ender's Game is actually already well on its way to being here. Of course, what we don't do is mislead children into believing that they are involved in military. But what's, I think, troublesome about the prospect is that actually the most effective military personnel in the future are likely to be children, because they're most capable at playing games.
Oh, yeah.
Which is horrific.
Yeah, also, of course, I'm not aware of eSports. Well, I just sometimes see it. And when you talked about the crossover with the army, I also thought of Max Verstappen. I'm not also a huge Formula One fan, but he also drives on in the eSport category.
Yeah, and there are programs where they take gamers, especially racing car gamers, and put them into physical cars. So, and it makes sense. Pilots are trained in simulation technology all the time. So I think it's profound, because it is sort of realizing what the film Ready Player One articulated, that actually it's possible that everything we do can be played out in virtual reality in the future. And as the technology gets more powerful, that seems increasingly to be the case.
Yeah.
Do we want it, though, is the question.
Yeah, that's maybe we come back to that. But the main reason I wanted to interview today was because I wrote an article on my website about human enhancement, and then I wrote a piece in it about the ethics, and then I found a piece by you in which you offered a sort of framework to think about the ethics of human enhancement, human augmentation. It's both on an individual, a professional, and a societal level. And I had the most questions with the professional ethics. Can you maybe elaborate on your model as a whole?
Yeah, so I wanted to distinguish between different types of transhumanist aspirations, but particularly, and often actually always, to reconcile what is, I think, a fundamental tension within transhumanism, posthumanism, or even just discussions about enhancement, which is the relationship between those radical aspirations to transform humanity and the more mundane reality that we're still not doing terribly well at keeping people healthy and beyond sort of repair or the need of repair. So how do you manage to support people to be free from biological suffering, but also allow them to go beyond the limits of biology, when often those two things may even be contradictory? So a good example of that is height. There are extremities of height beyond which it becomes not just socially debilitating, but also biologically risky. If you're too short, you can have lots of health problems. If you're too tall, you can have lots of health problems. Nature loves sort of an equilibrium, a sort of midpoint within a population to optimize health. So I've always been very conscious that my discussions about radical transhuman enhancements are not neglectful of the fact that many people simply suffer from illnesses and diseases that are horrific. And it makes no sense for us simply to pursue human enhancement when so many people are suffering. So the challenge has always been to reconcile that difference between the two. And I think for me, it comes down to mostly deciding what we're prepared to accept as a species, not just as individuals, but as a population. So you as an individual might say, well, I'd like to live to 80 years old or 100 years old, let's say. And across that lifetime, you want to be free from biological suffering, especially where this is about illness and disease, unwellness, if you like. You don't want to have to be in hospital. You don't want to be unable to move. You want to maximize freedom across that 100 years. The problem is, in order to do that, we probably need to embark on a project of human enhancement. In order to ensure that you are free from those illnesses, we need to modify your genome to protect you against those possibilities. That means selecting genes that are preferable to health and removing those that aren't. And then we get into really complicated questions, because not only are we making decisions about what kinds of lives are worth living, and in this case, we're saying that lives without illness and disease are less valuable than lives with illness and disease. And that's incredibly controversial, because it certainly affects people who are part of a population that have illnesses and disease, and on lots of different levels. So I have asthma, for example, which is quite mild, not significantly a part of my identity. I would quite happily have removed the propensity to asthma from my life, both as a genetic sort of cause, but also an environmental cause. So it's not tied to my identity. I don't feel like I am the person I am because I have asthma. But many people do feel that their way of living is defined by their different abilities. You hear this a lot in the context of deafness. And so some of those choices are not simply examples of suffering, or at least people disagree on whether they're suffering or not. And that's where it gets hard to decide whether something is justified to remove from our genome, or whether in fact we should keep these things. It's also complicated by the fact that some things that may be within ourselves that are likely to cause illnesses may at some point in our evolution protect us from other conditions. So you have this sort of anxiety about tampering with the genome in a way that may jeopardize sort of nature's grand project for us over our evolution. So these sorts of concerns lead for many people to adopt a kind of precautionary principle, where we say in the absence of knowledge, we do nothing. And I think this is at odds with the fact that we constantly expect medicine and science to keep us well, to keep us free from disease. And I think in order to reconcile this problem, we have to, as a society, decide whether in fact we accept a certain degree of suffering and don't seek to remove it, or whether we say, well, actually, no, we want to live as long and as healthy a life as possible. And that's what we should be doing, making sure that we achieve that as best we can, in the knowledge that we may not succeed, in the knowledge that if we remove 100 types of cancers, other cancers may come about. But there are people that believe for that reason, there's just no point. We shouldn't bother doing these things, because actually we cannot achieve a state of sort of biological perfection free from all ranges of sort of debilitating conditions. And we should allow just nature to take its course. But I think we're so far down the journey of modifying ourselves that it makes little sense to adopt that view. But it also goes against, I think, our inclination to act rather than be passive. And I think that's also something that we struggle with as a species, that we don't want to leave things to chance. If we can control them, if we can mitigate risks, then we seek to do so. But we don't always succeed. And in fact, sometimes we can make it a lot worse. And you can see that everywhere. You see that even in the debates about the climate emergency. I mean, on one level, almost everything we have done in history has made things worse for planet Earth. Not least of which is our procreation levels as a species. So it's clear that we are a often destructive species for other life and for life generally on Earth. So I think many people are excited by the idea of adopting new ways of being in the world, and are trying to work out what that demands of us. And it might demand of us the cessation of travel, not just flying, but all travel, or all things that require travel, like the movement of foods around the world, of products around the world. It's a major upheaval to social order. And it comes about through the fact that we have much more capacity to make changes now than we did 50 years ago even.
Yeah. And I can understand how, for example, my individual plans are confronted with like societal concerns. For example, think about, I want to become 1,000 years old. What if everybody does that? That's not a good idea. But I'm curious about the role of the professional, like, for example, the general or people in healthcare. I think that's the best. Do they have? How does their role change? Do they need more ethical considerations, or how do you look at that debate?
Well, I think it varies considerably across different professions. A good example of the challenge of that is around artificial intelligence at the moment. So it's often felt in many professions the best way to become more advanced is to bring AI into the decision-making process. And so there are lots of debates at the moment about the degree to which we are able to control AI, but also to make sure that humans are part of decision-making processes when AI has ultimate control. And you can see the sort of reasoning behind it is that the best professional is often the one most qualified and capable of delivering a set of tasks. But if the best AI is in fact a combination of hundreds of incredibly good professionals, then it gets beyond that level. The great example was, I think, from 1997 and the competition between Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue.
Yeah.
And what was interesting about that was not simply that the AI could win or beat Kasparov, but that the AI was programmed and informed by 6 grandmasters. So it was really Kasparov versus machine intelligence and 6 other masters. And I think if you are a patient of a healthcare professional, I think you might want to actually ensure that your advice, that decisions about your health are not just taken by one person, but if they can be the aggregation of all medical knowledge so that the decision or the advice is the best available, that's probably a better place to be. But it absolutely does mean that the doctor has to rethink their role in this equation completely, which is why I say that there is no job, no profession that is safe in the future. Everything is likely to change as a result of machine intelligence and humanity's will and expectation for greater certainty.
And what kind of technological trends at the moment do you think will have the biggest impact on our future? Will it be artificial intelligence and genetics and all genetic engineering, etc.?
Wow, it's a big question because, of course, it depends on how humanity's priorities change. And so across all fields, you can see major prospects of radical interventions. Take something like energy solutions. The capacity to realize fully sustainable energy has the greatest potential to transform humanity's capacity to survive, not just in places where we think there's low infrastructure or low technology already, but everywhere. And that's partly because we see an evidence of this climate emergency, which is leading to crazy things that are happening. I mean, take for example, the skiing industry, which has been around for a good number of years now, over a century-ish, more or less. But over the last 30 or 40 years, it's become a highly technological practice. Most of the slopes that you go to are engineered where snow is manufactured. Well, here's the crazy thing. As the glaciers are moving, they are now automating the production of ice onto the glacier so that it doesn't move any further. We are creating ice in order to stop the ice from moving in this sort of weird cyclical situation where the damage we created is now having to be transformed into more sustainable methods. But many people would say that 50 years from now, there is no skiing industry. So I think all these technologies are subject to the transforming dynamics of what's happening on planet Earth, and which will affect the resources we have available to do anything at all. It will affect the spaces in which people live and are able to function as social beings. So I think there's as much to say about the future of food as there is about the future of AI. And that's why it's not possible just to look at one thing. You have to examine the totality and the relationality of these technologies in order to understand both what is likely to happen, but also where there's urgent need to intervene. So it's possible that the most important thing genetics can do is actually make genetically modified crops that are less reliant on significant amounts of soil or water in order to have enough food in the world that people can actually live vegetarian or vegan lifestyles, because we know the opposite is causing climate change.
Yeah.
So I think taking that holistic approach, you can't just say we're looking at AI or we're looking at sort of human enhancement or genetics. It is, everything is transforming around us, and it requires this holistic approach to it.
Interesting. Yeah. We can go on because I was also thinking about GMOs and brown rice and like the cultural defense against using these technologies. But that's maybe for another time. I want to ask you, because your keynote was also about the role of academia in the public debates, if I can summarize it that way. Well, I'm not a scientist myself. I'm a science journalist or publicist. How do you look at the role of academia concerning emergent disruptive technologies, even on human augmentation, human enhancement, etc.?
So the first thing I would say is I'm quite happy for you to say you are a scientist, because for me, being a scientist is recognizing the merit and credibility of the scientific method. It's like being a transhumanist or whatever it is you want to be. The main thing is not whether you are generating new scientific knowledge in your professional life. It's about recognizing the credibility of the scientific method and advocating its importance in how we make decisions about the world. And I think what we're seeing at the moment in science, particularly through the expansion of citizen science, is people embracing that role, that even if you are not creating new knowledge, you are still signed up to science. And I think one of the failures of the university, of the sort of science industries, is to spend the majority of their history closing down the walls and the doors to the wider public. I remember a colleague of mine sat on the National Science Foundation in America, which is divided into departments, and he was on the sociology department. And he said that the amount of money that they were exploring to pay for a new telescope would fund the sociology department for 600 years. And I think that's indicative of the fact that we have to work across disciplines. We have to recognize and support colleagues who have different approaches to science. Because often we are, as a community, quite dismissive of each other's professions. Even here, I've heard people that, love ethics, hate ethics, love law, hate law. And so you see people less willing to recognize that actually all knowledge creation has a role in the social milieu. We have to enable people to pursue truth from whatever discipline they think has credibility. So the scientist's first starting point, I think, is to redress that relationship, to not think of themselves as uniquely placed to generate knowledge. And it's good to do that, because actually many of the most influential people to share knowledge about science are not scientists. We need to work with society much more widely to ensure that people appreciate and value the scientific method. And that's at the heart of what you see, I think, even in Greta Thunberg's activism. More often than not, what she's saying is listen to the science. Read the science, understand the science. She is, for me, a scientist because she supports that credibility of position. Because the alternative is catastrophic. It's either evidence or belief. And for me, evidence is crucial.
Yeah. Well, nice end to the the content part of the interview. I want to ask you one last question. If people are watching or listening and they want to know more about you and your work, where can they find you?
So you can find me anywhere on the internet, really. Google my name and it'll come up with my website, my Twitter account, even my mobile phone number. I think very much of myself as a kind of digital identity. And so being accessible across platforms has always been a big priority for me. And I think it's also the place where you discover so much more by being publicly visible, connecting with people that otherwise you'd never meet. And that's what's wonderful about the internet. With all its problems, it still creates space for interactions that otherwise would just be impossible.
Nice. I will put that in the show notes. And I want to thank you for this conversation, Professor Andy Miah.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.